The morning Lydia Shelton walked into the Caldwell livestock auction with every last coin she owned pressed tight in her fist. The sky above Kansas was the color of a bruise, and she had the terrible feeling that the day was going to split her clean in two. It was the spring of 1878, and Caldwell, Kansas was the kind of town that ate women like Lydia alive if they let it. Sitting right on the Kisham Trail, it drew cattlemen, gamblers, drifters, and dreamers from every corner of the territory, and the dust never quite settled on its main street because there was always someone new riding through to kick it back up. The auction house stood near the edge of town, a long, low building with warped timber walls and a roof that let the sunlight in through its gaps in thin golden stripes. On any given Tuesday in late April, the place smelled of horses and sawdust and the particular anxious sweat of men who had money to spend or money to lose. Lydia had neither kind of money. What she had was exactly $47.62, scraped together from 3 months of taking in laundry, mending shirts, and selling eggs from the 4 chickens she kept in the linta behind the small house she rented on the south side of town. She had counted those coins the night before at the kitchen table with a candle burning low, moving each one across the worn wood with the tip of her finger, her lips pressed together, her dark hair pinned back, and her green eyes steady even though her heart was hammering. $47.62. She needed $48 even to bid on the gray mare. The gray mare whose name was Pearl, according to the boy who had been leading her around the corral the previous afternoon when Lydia had gone to look. Pearl was 6 years old, sound in all 4 legs, gentle enough that the boy had let Lydia walk right up and press her hand to the horse's velvet nose without so much as a flinch. Pearl was the kind of horse a woman running a small freight delivery operation between Caldwell and the surrounding farmsteads needed desperately, because the aging mule Lydia currently used had pulled up lame 2 weeks prior and was never going to be right again. And without a horse there was no delivery route, and without the delivery route there was no income at all. Lydia was 26 years old. She had come to Caldwell 2 years earlier from Missouri, following a man who turned out not to deserve following, and she had stayed because she had nowhere better to go, and because she was not the kind of woman who ran from things she had started. Her father had died when she was 19, her mother 2 years after that, and she had one younger brother named Thomas who was farming land in Nebraska and could barely feed his own family. There was no cavalry coming for Lydia Shelton. There never had been. So she had 37 cents short of what she needed, and she walked into that auction house anyway, because she could not think of another option, and because sometimes you had to walk toward the thing that frightened you just to prove to yourself that you still could. The auction house was already thick with people by the time she got inside. Men in dusty coats and wide-brimmed hats stood in loose clusters, talking in low voices, sizing up the animals being walked through the back. There were a few women present, mostly ranchers' wives who had come with their husbands, and they watched Lydia with the curious sideways attention that single women always drew in places like this. She ignored them. She found the registration table near the door, where a heavy-set man with a red face and a ledger book was collecting bid deposits. The deposit to enter a bid on any animal was $1, which Lydia had. She paid it and received a small wooden paddle with the number 14 stamped on it in black ink. She held that paddle like it was made of something precious and made her way through the crowd toward the rows of rough-hewn benches that served as seating. Pearl came up third in the bidding order. Lydia sat through the first 2 lots with her hands folded in her lap and her back very straight, watching the way money moved through the room, watching which men were serious bidders and which ones were only there to feel important. She had learned to read rooms quickly. It was a skill that growing up without much protection had given her, the ability to assess who was dangerous and who was merely loud. Pearl was led out and the auctioneer, a wiry man named Hobbs who talked so fast his words ran together like creek water over smooth stones, started the bidding at $30. A man in a black coat near the front raised his paddle immediately. Lydia raised hers. The man in the black coat raised again. Lydia kept pace. Back and forth it went, the price climbing in $2 increments while the crowd murmured and shifted, and the gray mare stood quietly in the center of the floor as if she understood exactly what was being decided about her life. At $44, 3 other bidders dropped out. At 46, the man in the black coat paused and seemed to be calculating something, and Lydia felt a thin thread of hope pull tight in her chest. At 47, he raised his paddle again, almost lazily, and Hobbs called it out and looked around the room for any counter. Lydia raised her paddle. $48, which was exactly 38 cents more than she had in the small cloth purse in her coat pocket. Hobbs pointed at her. 48 from number 14. Do I hear 49? The man in the black coat looked at her for the first time. He had small eyes and a flat expression, and he raised his paddle without any particular hurry. 49. Do I hear 50? Lydia raised hers again. She did not have $50. She did not have 48. But she raised it because some stubborn wire in her spine simply would not let her do anything else. 50 from number 14. Do I hear 51? The man in the black coat shook his head slightly. Something in his face said the horse was not worth $50 to him, and they both knew it. Hobbs let the silence stretch, called it twice more, and then brought his gavel down like a period at the end of a sentence. Sold to number 14 for $50 even. The small cheer of relief that moved through Lydia lasted approximately 4 seconds, until she walked to the payment table and stood there with her purse open and counted out what she had, and the man behind the table looked at the coins and then at her and said, flatly, "You are $1 short, miss." "I have $47.62, Lydia said. "I know that is not 50. I know that." She heard how her own voice sounded, level and controlled, but underneath it something was trembling. "Is there any arrangement that could be made for the remainder? I could have the full amount within the week." The man shook his head. He was not unkind, but he was running an auction house, and auction houses did not run on promises. "I am sorry, miss, full payment is required before the animal leaves the premises. If you cannot cover the bid, the horse goes to the next highest bidder." The next highest bidder was the man in the black coat, who was already moving toward the table with an expression that said he had done this before, that this was something that happened to women who bid on things they could not afford, and he was not surprised. Lydia stood with her purse in her hands and all the noise of the auction house pressing in around her, and she looked down at the coins on the table. $47.62 arranged in a small scattered constellation, and she was trying very hard not to let her face do anything that would give anyone in that room something to look at. She was counting the coins again, as if counting them a second time might change what they added up to, when something caught her eye. A single silver dollar coin rested on the edge of the table, just to the right of her own money. It had not been there a moment before. She was certain of that with the particular certainty of a woman who had been counting coins all her life and knew exactly what was in front of her. She picked it up. It was real, solid and cool against her palm, the eagle on its face sharp and clear. She looked up immediately, scanning the crowd, because someone had just placed that coin on the table next to her money and she wanted to know who. The space around the payment table was busy, but she looked at every face within reach, and she saw nothing, no one meeting her eye, no one standing close enough to have just set something down. She turned further, looking toward the benches, the back of the room, the doorway. At the door, just passing through it, was the back of a man. She caught him only for a moment. The wide shoulders under a sun-faded blue shirt, the dark hat, the easy, unhurried stride of someone who had no particular reason to rush, because he had already done what he came to do. And then he was outside and gone, and the door swung shut on its leather hinge, and the light that had come in with his passing closed behind him like water closing over a stone. Lydia stood holding the silver dollar and felt something she could not have named precisely, something between gratitude and bewilderment and a strange tugging sensation in the center of her chest, as if a thread had been attached to her somewhere without her permission. She put the coin on the table with the rest of her money. $50.62. She paid the man exactly 50, took her change, took the lead rope he handed her, and went to collect Pearl. The gray mare pressed her nose into Lydia's shoulder as she led her out of the auction house, and Lydia allowed herself exactly 10 steps before she stopped walking and stood in the dusty yard and breathed slowly and let the relief move through her entirely, from her scalp down to her boot soles. Then she looked around for the man in the blue shirt. The yard was busy with horses and wagons and men moving purposefully in every direction. She walked Pearl through the crowd, turning her head, looking. There were plenty of blue shirts. There were plenty of dark hats. But she was looking for something specific, something she could not quite articulate, some quality of stillness she had caught in that brief glimpse at the doorway, and she did not find it. She walked Pearl home and got her settled in the lean-to with the lame mule, who regarded the horse with profound indifference. And then Lydia went inside and sat down at her kitchen table in the quiet and thought about a silver dollar appearing on a table out of nowhere, and a man walking out a door before she could look up properly, and the way that felt like something that mattered even though she could not explain why. She asked around Caldwell the next day. She was not the type to let a debt go unpaid or a mystery go unexamined. She described what she had seen to Mrs. Hanratty at the dry goods store, a woman who knew every soul within 30 miles by face and name and most of them by reputation. Mrs. Hanratty tilted her head and considered. Man about how old? I could not say with certainty, Lydia said. His back was to me. Broad shoulders, blue shirt faded, dark hat wide brim, tall. Half the cowboys in Caldwell matched that description on any given day, Mrs. Hanratty said, not unkindly. The drovers are coming through with the spring cattle drives. There are new faces every morning. I know, Lydia said. I just want to thank him, Mrs. Hanratty gave her a look that was knowing in a way Lydia chose to ignore. You could leave a notice at the saloon board. Men who pass through often check it for messages. I am not leaving a notice on a saloon board, Lydia said. She went home and thought about it and then went and left a note on the saloon board anyway, because a dollar was a dollar and someone had given her one without asking for anything, and that was not something she could simply let sit. The note said, "To the gentleman who assisted a lady at the livestock auction on April 22nd, your generosity is appreciated and I would like to repay the debt. Please inquire for Miss Shelton at the south end of Laramie Street." She felt foolish writing it and more foolish pinning it up, but she did it. 3 days passed. She set up her delivery route with Pearl, who proved to be everything the boy at the auction had promised, steady and willing and smart about the trail. The mule she sold to a farmer 2 miles east who had use for him in lighter work and paid her $8 for him, which helped. She settled back into her rhythm, rising before dawn, loading her wagon, making her rounds to the farmsteads that ordered flour and nails and seed and lamp oil from town, returning by mid-afternoon. On the 4th day after she put up the notice, she was loading her wagon in front of the general store when she became aware of someone standing at the edge of the boardwalk behind her. She turned around. He was leaning against the post with one shoulder, arms loosely crossed, watching her with an expression that was direct but not aggressive, interested but not intrusive. He was taller than she had imagined from that brief doorway glimpse, with the kind of lean, muscled build that came from years of outdoor work rather than the gym. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with sharp jaw and dark eyes under the brim of a hat that was indeed dark and wide-brimmed, and he was wearing a different shirt today, a darker one, but she knew him anyway. She could not have explained how she knew, but she did. "You are the man from the auction," she said. He straightened up from the post. "Yes, ma'am." His voice was low and unhurried with a slight southern edge to it. "Walter Ford." "Lydia Shelton," she said. She looked at him steadily. "I put up a notice. I saw it. I owe you $1. Something in his expression shifted slightly, just at the edges, not quite a smile but something adjacent to one. "You do not owe me anything, Miss Shelton." "I do," she said. "$1 is $1, Mr. Ford, and I do not accept charity." He looked at her for a moment longer, considering something. "It was not charity," he said finally. "Then what was it?" He seemed to think about that. "A reasonable thing to do," he said, which was not much of an answer, but he said it in a way that made her think there was more underneath it, and he was choosing, carefully, how much of it to show. She reached into her coat pocket and produced $1 coin, which she had been carrying since the day she put up the notice specifically for this purpose. She held it out. "Thank you for the reasonable thing," she said. "I am capable of managing my own affairs." He took the coin without argument, which she appreciated. Some men would have made a performance of refusing it, forcing her into a negotiation about her own dignity. He simply took it and put it in his vest pocket and said, "I can see that." She went back to loading her wagon. He did not immediately leave, which she noticed without acknowledging. She lifted a crate of nails and he moved forward and took it from her with a matter-of-fact ease that was not condescending but simply efficient, and set it in the wagon bed exactly where she had been aiming it. "I did not ask for help," she said. "No," he agreed, and picked up the next crate. She should have been irritated. She was not quite, and that itself was interesting. She watched him load the remaining 3 crates with the same unhurried competence he seemed to apply to everything, and then he stepped back and looked at the loaded wagon and looked at her and said, "Where are you headed this morning?" "North Road," she said. "4 stops, I will be back by 2. "I am headed that direction myself," he said. "Brannigan's spread." "Brannigan's is my last stop," she said. There was a small silence in which they looked at each other, and both of them understood simultaneously that they were about to spend the better part of a morning in each other's company, and that neither of them was going to pretend that was not the case. "I will ride alongside, if you do not object," he said. She did not object. She told herself on the way out of town that she was simply being sensible about it. The North Road was the North Road, and they were both going the same direction, and there was nothing to make of that. She told herself that for about the first 2 miles, until they had settled into the easy quiet of 2 people who are not yet comfortable enough to talk freely but are not uncomfortable either, and she found herself watching him from the corner of her eye and noting the way he sat his horse, a solid brown quarter horse he called Ranger, with the relaxed authority of someone who had been riding since before he could walk. "How long have you been in Caldwell?" she asked. 3 weeks, he said. "I came up with Greer's outfit from Texas. We brought about 800 head, sold them off at the rail depot 4 days ago." "And you stayed," she said. "I stayed," he confirmed, and did not elaborate immediately, and then after a moment he said, "I am thinking about land. There is a quarter section east of town that I have had my eye on. Reasonable water, good grass." "You want a ranch," she said. "I want to build something," he said, which was different enough from what she had said that she looked at him directly. He was looking at the road ahead, and the morning light was on the side of his face, and she noticed he was probably 28 or 30, older than the average drover but younger than most men who talked about building things as if they had already decided. "Where are you from originally?" she asked. "Virginia," he said. "Before the war, after from wherever there was work." He said it without self-pity or bitterness, the way people who have learned to make peace with difficult facts spoke about them. She recognized that tone because she used it herself. "Missouri," she said when he glanced at her in a way that was clearly an invitation to share the same. "I know Missouri," he said. "What part?" "Outside Hannibal," she said. "My father had land." "Had," he said. "He died in 1869, she said. "Fever." He nodded, just once, the nod that said understood without pressing for more. She appreciated that more than she would have expected. Her first stop was the Hartley farm, where she delivered 2 sacks of flour, a tin of lamp oil, and a packet of needles and thread that Mrs. Hartley had ordered specifically. Walter waited on the road with her wagon and his horse while she carried the goods to the door and collected payment, and exchanged the brief necessary pleasantries. When she came back, he had checked the hitch on Pearl's harness and found it had loosened slightly and retightened it, and he mentioned this in passing the way he had loaded the crates, without ceremony. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a different register than she had at the auction. The second stop was the widow Parsons, who was 73 and lived alone on 30 acres she had no business running by herself and refused any suggestion that she might not be up to it. She came to the door with her white hair pinned up in her back straight and her eyes sharp as a hawk's, and she looked past Lydia at Walter with immediate and undisguised assessment. "Who is that?" she asked, at a volume that carried perfectly well to where Walter stood on the road. "Walter Ford," Lydia said. "He is heading to Brannigan's. He looks useful," Mrs. Parsons said, appraising him with the frank, unsentimental eye of a woman who had spent 50 years measuring men for their practical value. "Is he honest?" "I have known him for approximately 2 hours," Lydia said, "so I am not yet in a position to say." Mrs. Parsons snorted. 2 hours is usually enough if you are paying attention. She took her delivery and said, at the same carrying volume, "You are welcome to come in for water on your way back, Mr. Ford." "Much obliged, ma'am," Walter called back, and when Lydia turned away from the door she caught the almost smile on his face again and looked away before he could see that she had noticed it. The third stop was the Hanson farm, where the father was out in the field and the teenage son accepted the delivery with a practiced solemn efficiency, and Lydia spent exactly 4 minutes there. Back on the road, Walter had produced a small wrapped bundle from his saddlebag and was eating what appeared to be a biscuit, and he offered her one without comment, and she took it because she had not eaten since before dawn, and it was getting on toward midday. They ate in companionable silence for a stretch of road, and then she asked him about the drive up from Texas, because it was an interesting subject, and because she wanted to hear him talk. He described it well, without embellishment but with a natural eye for detail, the particular quality of the light over the Red River crossing, the way the herd moved in the early morning like a single slow dark tide, the 3 days of rain south of Wichita that turned everything into a uniform miserable brown. He talked about the men he had worked with, some of them several years running, with the kind of easy, warm regard that told her he was someone who formed genuine attachments even in transient circumstances. "You miss it," she said. "The driving." He thought about that genuinely, not just saying whatever answer came first. "I miss some of it," he said. "The country. The work itself when it goes well. But I am 30 years old and I have been sleeping on the ground for most of the last decade, and I think I am ready to sleep in the same place 2 nights in a row." 30, she said. "You do not look it." "You are being kind," he said. "I am not particularly kind," she said. "I am precise," and he laughed then, a real laugh, short and warm, and the sound of it did something unexpected to the air around them. Brannigan's Spread was a well-run operation about 8 miles north of town. The rancher himself, a heavy-set red-faced Irishman named Declan Brannigan, came out of the barn when they rode in and greeted Lydia with the comfortable familiarity of a regular customer, and looked at Walter with the slightly different greeting he gave to men he was considering. "Ford," Walter said, extending his hand. "I was told you might have some fence work that needed doing." "Who told you that?" Brannigan said. "Tom Greer," Walter said, "before we parted ways." Brannigan shook the offered hand and his expression settled into something more welcoming. "Greer's man," he said. "Good enough reference. Come look at the east pasture and we will talk terms." Lydia collected her payment for the delivery and said her goodbyes and was turning Pearl back toward the road when Walter came around the corner of the barn at a jog and caught up to her wagon. "Miss Shelton," he said. She stopped. He had his hat in his hand and the sun was full on his face, and she thought, with the part of her brain that noticed things before the rest of her had decided what to do about them, that he had a very honest face. "I will be in Caldwell through at least the summer," he said. "If there is work here with Brannigan," he paused, turning the hat brim in his hands in a small, slow circle, "I would like to call on you if that would be acceptable." She looked at him for a moment. You left a coin on a table for a woman you had never spoken to, she said. Yes, he said. Why? He met her eyes steadily. Because you needed it, he said, and because I had it, and because it seemed like the right thing. He paused again. I saw you counting at the table before the bidding. I could see how close you were running. He said this matter-of-factly, without any implication that she should be embarrassed by it. You were not going to ask anyone for help. That was obvious, so I left before you could make it into something it did not need to be. You were watching me, she said. I was, he said simply. I have been watching you since you walked into that auction house and found yourself a seat and sat with your spine like a board and your chin up and your hands in your lap like you owned the whole room and were simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up with you. The silence that followed that was of a particular quality. Lydia was not a woman who was easily caught off balance, but she was, at this moment, something close to it. You may call on Sunday, she said. 4 o'clock. Yes, ma'am, he said, and stepped back. And she clicked to Pearl and drove back toward the road and did not look back. Because she did not need to, and because, if she did, she would have been unable to prevent her face from doing something she was not yet ready to let him see. He came on Sunday at 4 o'clock with his hat cleaned, and his boots polished, and a small paper-wrapped bundle that turned out to contain 4 good apples, which was exactly the right gift for someone who kept a horse and had a practical soul, and she appreciated the thoughtfulness of it more than she might have appreciated flowers, which she was not sure she would have known what to do with. They sat on the small front porch of her rented house in the late afternoon sun, and she made coffee and they talked for 2 hours. And it was the kind of talking that does not require effort, the kind where the conversation finds its own current and carries you along, and you realize at the end of it that you have said more than you intended and learned more than you expected. He told her about Virginia before the war, a farm with good black soil, and an oak tree in the yard that he had climbed every day of his childhood. His father and older brother had both died at Gettysburg in 1863 when he was 15, and his mother had held the farm for 3 years after that before it was taken for tax debts she could not cover. He had gone west at 17, which was young to be alone in the world but not unusual for boys in those years who had nothing left behind them. Your mother, Lydia said. Where is she now? She died in 1871, he said. She had a sister in Richmond who took her in. She passed quietly from what I was told. I was in New Mexico at the time. He said this with the calm of a man who has had years to make a place for grief and had given it one, not suppressing it but not wearing it either. She recognized this process from her own experience and it made her feel in an odd way less alone. I think we are alike in some ways, she said. He looked at her with those direct, dark eyes. I think so too, he said. I noticed it early. What did you notice? That you do not ask for things, he said. That you work very hard at not needing anything from anyone. That this is a choice you made at some point and you are very committed to it. She was quiet for a moment. The sun was lower now, the light amber and long across the yard, and Pearl was visible through the open lean-to door, her gray coat catching the gold. Is that a criticism? Lydia asked. No, he said. I understand it. I have done the same thing. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. I am only saying that I noticed. She looked at him. What do you want, Mr. Ford, in the larger sense? He thought about it seriously, which she had already come to expect from him. Land, he said. Something built with my own hands that is there in 10 years. Work that means something, someone to share it with. He paused. In the larger sense. That last part, she said. Yes, he said. You barely know me, she said. I know more than you might think, he said, and I am interested in learning the rest. That is all I am saying. She looked at him for a long moment, measuring him the way she measured everything, honestly and without sentiment. She found nothing she did not like. That was, in itself, remarkable. You may come again next Sunday, she said. He came again the next Sunday, and the one after that. By the 3rd Sunday they were on first names. By the 4th she had cooked dinner instead of just coffee, and he had arrived with a small bunch of wildflowers that he presented with a kind of straightforward simplicity that made them feel like exactly the right gesture. By the fifth Sunday, they had fallen into a rhythm of easy honesty that she had never quite found with anyone before, a quality of conversation where neither of them pretended to be something they were not. He had taken the fencing work at Brannigan's and supplemented it with a few other odd jobs around the ranches north of town, and the quarter section east of Caldwell was still in his thoughts. He had met with the land agent twice. The price was manageable if the summer work held. "Tell me about the land," she said one evening, the sixth or seventh Sunday, sitting on her porch in the blue dusk with the fireflies just starting. He described it with a care and attention that told her it was already real to him in his mind, not a dream but a plan. "Good grassland," he said, "a creek in the southwest corner that ran reliable. The soil was not deep, but it was good and he knew how to work it. He had ideas about cattle, a small herd to start, quality over numbers, and about a kitchen garden and fruit trees and a house built to last rather than built in a hurry." "It sounds like something worth building," she said. He looked at her in that way he had that was direct without being pushy, that held a question without demanding an answer. "I think so," he said quietly. She looked out at the yard. Pearl moved in the lean-to. The fireflies were out in numbers now, small lights drifting in the warm dark. "I need you to understand something about me," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I followed a man here from Missouri 2 years ago," she said. "I thought he was something he was not. When I found out what he actually was, I left. The leaving was harder than the following because I had put a great deal of stock in my own judgment, and being wrong about him was difficult." She paused. "I have been very careful about my judgment since then." "What was he?" Walter asked, not prying, not sensational about it, just asking because she had opened the door and he wanted to understand. "He was married already," she said. "He neglected to mention that until I was here and had given up my living in Missouri." She kept her voice even. "He thought I would adapt to the situation. I did not." "Good," Walter said, flatly and with a finality that made something ease in her chest. "I am not easy to trust," she said. "I am working on my judgment still. I want you to understand that when I tell you that you appear to be what you say you are, that assessment carries a good deal of weight because I am stingy with it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have never been anything other than what I am. I cannot promise perfection. But I can tell you that there is nothing I am hiding from you and nothing I intend to hide." He met her eyes. "I think you are worth being straight with." She held his gaze. "I think you might be the most straightforwardly decent man I have ever met," she said, "and I am not entirely sure what to do with that." He smiled then, not the almost smile she had seen before, but a full one, and it changed his face entirely, made it younger and warmer, and she felt something unlock in her that had been locked for a long time. "I expect you will figure it out," he said. "You seem to be good at figuring things out." He rode for the land agent's office on a Monday in late May, and made an offer on the quarter section east of town, and the agent came back 3 days later with a counter, and they settled on a price that took most of Walter's savings from the cattle drive and committed him to a note with the bank that he would need 2 solid seasons to clear. He told Lydia about it that Sunday with a quiet, contained excitement that was more revealing than any dramatic announcement would have been. "You signed the papers," she said. "Yesterday morning," he said. He looked at her with something very careful and very deliberate in his eyes. "I want to show it to you, if you would like to see it." She looked back at him. They were both being very precise about what they were saying and what they were not saying, and they both knew it. "Yes," she said, "I would like to see it." He took her out to the land on a Tuesday afternoon, the first time in all their Sundays that they had gone anywhere beyond the road to Brannigan's and back. He rode Ranger and she drove Pearl, and they went east along a track that was more suggestion than road, through bluestem grass that came to Pearl's knees and rippled in the May wind like something alive. The land was what he had described and better in the seeing. The grass was thick and the creek in the southwest corner was clear and cold and ran strong over smooth stones. There was a rise in the east section that gave you a view for miles in every direction, and she stood on it with the wind pulling at her hair and looked at the sky, which was that particular shade of Kansas blue that made you believe, against all evidence, that anything was possible. "Well," he said, standing beside her. "You did not oversell it," she said. "I try not to oversell things," he said. She looked at the lay of the land, at where the grass was good and where the water ran, and where the rise sheltered the creek from the north wind. "The house should go there," she said, pointing to a spot on the eastern slope of the rise, sheltered from the north but open to the south and morning light. "You would get sun through the winter and shade in the afternoon in summer, and you can see the whole property from the porch." He stood looking at where she was pointing with an expression she had not seen on him before, something open and moved and carefully controlled. "That is exactly where I was thinking," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The wind moved through the grass around them with a long, sustained sound like breathing. "Walter," she said. "Lydia," he said, in the same tone, which was to say everything and nothing at once. She reached over and put her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with a quiet certainty, not desperate, not hesitant, simply sure. They stood like that looking at the land for a long time, and the wind moved through the blue stem, and the creek made its sound in the distance, and something that had been in the process of becoming finally arrived. He kissed her for the first time on the ride back, when they had stopped at the creek crossing to let the horses drink, and she was standing on the bank watching the water, and he came and stood beside her, and she turned and looked at him, and the look said everything. And he held her face in both hands and kissed her with a gentleness and a sincerity that made her feel, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, entirely safe. Summer came in fast and bright, and Walter worked the land and the fence line at Brannigan's and other spreads, building reserves, planning, and every Sunday without exception he was on Lydia's porch at 4 o'clock with something small and thoughtful. A book from the general store's limited library, a packet of seeds for the kitchen garden she was talking about starting. Once a length of good blue ribbon that he said matched her eyes, and delivered with such unembarrassed simplicity that she did not know whether to laugh or be undone by it, and ended up something in between. She was building her delivery route into something more substantial, taking on more farmsteads to the north and south, and considering adding a second wagon. She talked about this with Walter in the same way he talked about the land, practically, specifically, working through numbers and logistics, and he listened with real attention and contributed useful thinking, and never once implied that her ambitions were anything other than entirely sensible. He had started clearing the building site in June, setting posts for a corral first, then beginning to notch and stack the timber for the house walls. He had hired a young man from town named Eddie Marsh, 17 and eager, and needing to earn money for his family after his father's illness, to help with the heavy work. Lydia drove out twice a week after her deliveries to bring them lunch and to look at the progress, and the three of them would eat in the shade of the half-built walls and talk, and it became the part of her week she most looked forward to. It was on one of these afternoons in late June that Walter said to her, with characteristic directness and no preamble, "I am going to ask you to marry me before the summer is out. I want you to know that so you have time to make up your mind properly and not feel put on the spot." She stared at him. Eddie, who was picking at the remains of his biscuit, suddenly found something very interesting to look at in the middle distance. "That," she said carefully, "may be the most unromantic delivery of a romantic intention I have ever heard." "I know," he said. "I am not much for speeches, but I thought you would prefer the straight version." She was quiet for a moment. A meadowlark was singing somewhere in the grass. The half-built walls stood in the afternoon light, solid and real and promising. "You are right," she said. "I would." He looked at her steadily. "So you have time to think on it." "I do not need until the summer is out," she said. He waited. "I need until Sunday," she said. He nodded once, the nod that meant understood. Eddie was still looking at the middle distance with extraordinary concentration. She spent the week doing what she had promised herself she would do, which was to think about it honestly and thoroughly without letting either her want of it or her fear of it do the thinking for her. She thought about what she knew of Walter Ford over 3 months, that he was honest when honesty was inconvenient, that he did not make promises he was not prepared to keep, that he was kind to Eddie and to Mrs. Parsons and to the horses, and to strangers who needed a coin left on a table without making them feel beholden. She thought about the way she felt standing on the rise of his land with her hand in his, the way that had felt like arrival rather than departure. She thought about 2 years of managing alone, and the great effort of it, and the great pride of it, and the fact that being with Walter did not feel like giving up the pride of it, but like having someone to stand beside while she kept it. She thought about the man in Missouri. She laid that memory out straight and looked at it, and asked herself honestly whether Walter was anything like it. And the answer was not only no, but emphatically and evidently no. And she trusted the judgment that produced that answer because she had spent 2 years sharpening it, and because it had never wavered about him in 4 months of close observation. On Sunday she was on the porch when he rode up, and she stood up from her chair and walked down the steps to meet him before he had even dismounted, and he saw her face and swung down from Ranger and met her in the yard. "Yes," she said, in case that was not clear. He stood in front of her with an expression she had never quite seen on him before, something bright and unguarded that looked like happiness without complication. He took her hands in both of his. "It was clear," he said. "Good," she said, and then they were both laughing, quietly, the way people laugh when something they wanted very much has happened, and he pulled her in and held her, and she let herself be held, and the afternoon was warm and the meadowlarks were singing in the grass past the fence, and Pearl watched all of it from the linta with her large, calm eyes. The ring came from the jeweler in Caldwell 2 weeks later, a simple gold band with a small garnet set in it, dark red as a coal. He put it on her finger at the kitchen table over coffee, nothing ceremonial, just him taking her hand and sliding it on and her looking at it and then looking at him. "It fits," she said. "I asked Mrs. Hanratty," he admitted. "She seemed to know." "Of course she did," Lydia said and smiled and turned her hand so the garnet caught the light. They were married in September of 1878, at the small Presbyterian church on Caldwell's Main Street, on a bright, sharp morning when the cottonwoods along the creek were going gold. The congregation was small but genuinely warm. Mrs. Parsons in her best dress with her white hair pinned up and her sharp eyes suspiciously bright, Declan Brannigan and his wife Margaret, young Eddie Marsh looking scrubbed and nervous in a borrowed coat, Mrs. Hanratty, who had taken a proprietary interest in the whole affair, and a handful of neighboring ranchers and farmwives who had come to know and respect Lydia through her delivery route. Lydia wore a dress of dark blue wool that she had made herself from good fabric she had splurged on at the dry goods store, fitted and simple, and she had flowers from the widow Parsons' garden in her hair. She walked down the aisle of the small church on her own, which she had insisted upon, because she had come into this life by her own means, and she intended to walk toward the next part of it the same way. Walter stood at the front of the church in a dark coat and clean shirt with his hat in his hands, and when she came through the door and he saw her, his expression went through about 4 things in quick succession before settling into something quiet and radiant and entirely his own. The minister was a thin, earnest man named Reverend Cole, who did his job with dignity and without excessive length. When he said in the plain language of the ceremony, "Do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Lydia said, "I do," with a clarity and steadiness that left absolutely no room for misinterpretation, and Walter said, "I do," in a voice that was low and sure and meant every syllable. When he kissed her at the altar, Mrs. Parsons made a sound that was in no way related to crying, and Mrs. Hanratty did not bother to pretend. They had a wedding lunch at the hotel's dining room, which ran for 3 hours and involved 2 kinds of pie and a great deal of coffee and laughter, and Brannigan gave a toast that was simultaneously embarrassing and touching, and ended with him raising his glass and saying, "To a man who is building something worth building, and a woman who deserves someone worth having," which was not exactly eloquent but was true enough that it worked. They drove out to the land that evening, the two of them, as the sun went down and the sky went rose and amber behind the cottonwoods. The house was not finished yet. The walls were up and the roof was on, but the interior was still rough. But there was a good iron stove already installed because Walter had done that first, and it gave off a steady warmth against the September chill. She stood in the middle of what would be the main room and looked at the walls and the stove and the window that faced south toward the creek, and she thought about the kitchen table she would put here and the shelves there, and the garden she was already planning in her mind, and she felt the particular satisfaction of a person who has arrived somewhere worth arriving. "Welcome home," Walter said, from behind her. She turned to look at him. He was standing in the doorway with the last of the evening light behind him, and she thought again, as she had thought many times over the past months, that he had the most honest face she had ever seen. "Home," she said, and let the word settle. They worked that autumn and into the winter with the sustained purposefulness of two people who know exactly what they are doing and why. Walter finished the interior of the house, laying a pine floor and building a proper kitchen with shelves and a dry sink, while Lydia ran her delivery route and began planning the kitchen garden for spring, and kept the accounts with the meticulous care that had always been her particular strength. She found, as winter came on and they lived together in the finished house with the stove burning and snow on the range grass, and the horses in the good barn Walter had built, that she was happy in a way that was not dramatic or complicated but was instead deep and steady and full, the way good water runs, not flashy but inexhaustible. She had not expected happiness to feel so much like settling into the right shape of yourself, but it did. He was easy to live with, which she had half expected and still found remarkable in practice. He was tidy without being rigid about it. He was quiet in the mornings, which she was also, and they had developed an easy domestic rhythm of moving around each other in the kitchen without getting in each other's way. He read when the evenings were long, and she sewed or wrote letters, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they did not, and both kinds of evening were good. He had a quality she had not fully anticipated, which was tenderness. It came out in small ways. The way he checked on Pearl before he came inside each night, the way he brought her coffee without asking when she was working late on accounts, the way he would find her hand in the dark and hold it with no more ceremony than breathing. She was learning to receive these things without deflecting them, which was its own kind of work, and she thought he understood this because he never commented on it, only kept offering. She told him in February that she was pregnant. They were at the kitchen table after dinner, and she set down her coffee and said, as directly as she did most things, "I believe we are expecting a child in late summer." He looked at her, and the expression on his face was the unguarded bright thing she had seen on Sunday in the yard, multiplied by something large and serious. He reached across the table and took both her hands and held them and did not say anything for a moment, and she understood that he was having feelings about this that were too large for words and did not require them. "Are you pleased?" she asked. "I am," he said in a voice that was somewhat unsteady, profoundly pleased. He turned her hands over and pressed them and met her eyes. "Are you?" "Yes," she said. "I am frightened and very pleased." "Me too," he said simply. Spring came and the kitchen garden went in. Beans and squash and tomatoes, and the small herb bed she had been planning all winter. The delivery route continued to grow, and she worked it until July when the pregnancy was advanced enough that the wagon jostling was uncomfortable. And then she arranged with a young man from town named David Ray's to run the route in her place until she was ready to return, paying him fairly and keeping the accounts herself, which was the most important part. The land was coming together. Walter had bought 6 good cattle in the spring, Texas Longhorns, with a plan to breed up to a small herd over several years. The grass was good that summer, high and thick, and the cattle were thriving. He had repaired the creek crossing and fenced 2 additional pastures, and was talking about adding another section to the east when the bank note on the original was further paid down. In August, on a night when the heat lightning was flickering on the horizon and the wind was warm and the whole world smelled like grass and rain coming, Lydia gave birth to their son. He was born at home, attended by the doctor from town, a capable, steady man named Dr. Ames, and by Margaret Brannigan, who had 3 children herself and had volunteered her presence with the practical authority of a woman who knew she would be useful. Walter was in the parlor for the entire duration, and twice Dr. Ames had to come out and tell him firmly to sit down and stop wearing holes in the floor. When it was over and the doctor brought him in, Walter sat on the edge of the bed beside Lydia and looked at the infant in her arms with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. The baby was red-faced and very new, with a dark cap of hair, and he was making small sounds of profound complaint about the world he had just been introduced to. "Hello," Walter said to him, very quietly, as if greeting someone he had been expecting. "What do we call him?" Lydia said. They had talked about names and not settled. She had offered several, he had offered several, none of them had stuck until now. Walter looked at the baby and then at her. "James," he said, "for no particular reason except that it sounds like someone worth knowing." She looked at her son, James. It settled over him like something that had always been true. "James Henry Ford," she said. Henry had been her father's name. Walter's face did something quiet and significant. "Henry," he said. "Yes, that is right, Mrs. Parsons came to visit 3 days later and looked at James Henry Ford with the sharp, assessing gaze she applied to everything, and declared him a handsome and sensible-looking baby, and presented Lydia with a quilt she had made over the winter in preparation, which was blue and white, and clearly the product of a great many evenings of careful work. Lydia thanked her with genuine feeling, and Mrs. Parsons waved it off with the characteristic efficiency that covered her warmth like a good practical coat covers a person against the cold. James was a healthy baby, vigorous and opinionated from the first week, which Lydia found deeply satisfying even when it was exhausting. Walter was present and hands-on in a way that she had hoped for but had not let herself depend on, doing the night wakings with her without complaint, walking the baby when he cried, learning quickly and without self-consciousness the physical language of caring for a small person. "You are good at this," she said, watching him walk James in the early morning kitchen light, the baby's cheek on his shoulder, Walter's big hand spread across the small back. "I like him," Walter said simply. "He is interesting." "He is 3 weeks old," she said. "He is already very clear about what he thinks," Walter said. "I respect that in a person." She laughed softly, so as not to disturb the baby who was finally going quiet. Outside the window the range grass was going gold with autumn coming, and the sky was enormous and blue, and the whole world was right in this kitchen at this moment, and she was aware of it with a clarity that felt like something she wanted to keep. That autumn she returned to running her delivery route, with James in a carrier she had designed herself, a fitted arrangement of canvas and buckles that held him snug against her chest while she drove, which scandalized Mrs. Hanratty briefly until she saw how entirely comfortable and happy the baby was in it, at which point she declared it a very practical solution and quietly told 3 other mothers about it. Walter had 2 of the cattle calve in October, good strong calves, and this was the start of the herd building itself in the gradual way he had planned. He was also doing fence work for Brannigan and 2 other ranches that winter, building reserves, never idle, never extravagant. He paid down the bank note faster than he had projected, because the summer had been good and the fall cattle market was strong. Eddie Marsh, who was 18 now and had been working for Walter since before the house was finished, had turned into a genuinely skilled hand, and Walter was paying him well and teaching him everything he knew, with the particular generosity of a man who believes that skills grow when you give them away. Christmas of 1879 was the first Christmas in the finished house, with a tree from the creek bottom and James sitting up independently and extremely interested in everything within reach. Walter had carved a small set of wooden animals over the previous months, a horse and a cow and a dog, smooth and careful work, and James regarded the horse with an intense concentration that lasted approximately 4 minutes before he attempted to eat it. "He has good taste," Walter said. "He has teeth coming in," Lydia said, retrieving the horse. She looked at Walter across their son's head. "I am very glad," she said, which was not a complete sentence and did not need to be. He leaned across and kissed her temple. "So am I," he said. The winter of 1879 going into 1880 was cold but not brutal, and they weathered it well in the good house with the iron stove working hard and the barn tight and the cattle in reasonable condition. Walter had added a root cellar in the fall and it was full, and the kitchen garden produce that Lydia had put up through the summer was on the shelves in orderly rows, and the whole domestic architecture of their life felt both earned and secure. In the spring of 1880, they had news from Walter's direction. Tom Greer, who had been Walter's boss on the cattle drive 2 years before, was looking to sell a small neighboring section to the north. It was rougher land than theirs, more rocky, but it had a good spring and additional pasture that Walter had been eyeing since he bought the original quarter section. He talked through the numbers with Lydia over a week of evenings, and she worked through the accounts with him, and they decided together to make the offer. The bank agreed to extend the note, and Greer agreed to the price, and by April Walter owned a half section of Kansas land with good water and good grass, and a plan for a real cattle operation that was no longer just possibility but momentum. There were difficulties too, as there always were in that country in those years. A late spring storm in 1880 killed 2 of the cattle and damaged a section of fence and cost a week of hard work and enough money to make things tight. There was a dispute with a neighbor to the south, a man named Calhoun, about a fence line that Calhoun claimed encroached on his property, and this went on for 2 months of tense conversations and surveyor visits and carefully managed tension before it was resolved in Walter's favor by the county survey record. Calhoun took it poorly, but there was nothing legal to do about it, and Walter handled the whole thing with a careful patience that kept it from becoming something worse. The town of Caldwell was changing too, in ways that were both good and difficult. The cattle trade brought money, and with money came more permanence, more families. A new school in 1880 that Lydia was involved in organizing and fundraising for because James would need it in a few years, and because schools meant the town was becoming something that lasted. But the cattle trade also brought violence sometimes, the kind that erupted in saloons late at night between men with whiskey and grudges, and there were shootings in those years that the town's marshal dealt with as best he could, and the newspaper reported with the matter-of-fact brevity of people accustomed to such things. It was a real world with real difficulties, and she and Walter lived in it honestly, neither pretending it was simpler than it was nor letting its difficulties swamp the good things. In the fall of 1880, Lydia was pregnant again. This time she told Walter in the evening on the porch, with James asleep inside and the stars coming out over the range, and he took her hand and held it in that quiet, sure way and said, "How are you feeling about it?" "Good," she said. "Tired already, but good." She paused. "I would like a daughter." "I would be pleased with either," he said. "So would I," she said, "but I would like a daughter." She was born in April of 1881, in the same room as her brother, attended again by Dr. Ames, and this time also by Mrs. Parsons, who had appointed herself midwife to Lydia's children, with a cheerful authority that no one had thought to question. She was smaller than James had been, with Lydia's dark hair and Walter's dark eyes, and she announced herself to the world with a clear, strong cry that made Dr. Ames say, "Well, that one is not shy," and made Walter, standing in the doorway where he had been allowed to stay this time, take a long, slow breath and look at his daughter with an expression of helpless, devoted astonishment. "Clara," Lydia said, holding her. She had known the name for months. "Clara Me Ford." "Clara," Walter repeated as if testing it. He sat beside them and looked at the baby and at Lydia. "That is exactly right." "It is, isn't it?" she said, and smiled. James's reaction to his sister was one of the great pleasures of that spring. He was nearly 2, walking confidently and into everything and possessed of strong opinions about most subjects. And he regarded Clara with a serious proprietary interest that evolved over the first weeks from cautious observation to a fierce protective attachment that manifested in following her everywhere and periodically bringing her objects of perceived value, usually rocks. "He is like a small butler," Walter said, watching James carefully carry a piece of smooth quartz to where Clara lay on her blanket in the afternoon light. "He has appointed himself head of household staff on her behalf. He has your instinct for it," Lydia said, "the appearing out of nowhere with useful things." Walter looked at her. "Is that what I do?" "It is exactly what you do," she said. "You have been doing it since an auction in April of 1878. He smiled at that, the full, warm smile. "I was hoping you would not hold that against me indefinitely." "I hold it for you," she said. "There is a difference." He reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with the gentleness that was his particular quality, and looked at her with everything in his eyes that he had said and not said over 3 years of marriage. "I know," he said. "The summer of 1881 was long and golden and full. The herd was growing steadily, 12 cattle now and 2 working horses in addition to Ranger and Pearl, and Eddie Marsh had become practically a partner in the daily operation of the place, though Walter paid him a fair wage and had been helping him save toward land of his own. The delivery route was thriving, and Lydia had indeed added a second wagon, with David Ray's running the southern loop 3 days a week while she handled the north. The accounts were in good order, and the bank note on the extended section was on schedule. James spent the summer following his father around the farm with the focused devotion of a child who has identified his primary model of how to be in the world and intends to study it thoroughly. Walter taught him, at nearly 3, how to water the horses by letting him hold the bucket, how to count by counting fence posts, how to read a sky for weather in the simplified version appropriate to a small child. He was patient with James in a way that was never performative, simply consistently present and interested and willing to explain things as many times as they needed explaining. Clara, meanwhile, was growing with speed and determination, and an expression of profound personal authority that made Mrs. Parsons, who visited regularly and considered both children largely her own grandchildren, say with great satisfaction, "That one is going to run things." "Several things, I expect," Lydia said, watching Clara navigate toward a sunlit patch on the kitchen floor with the absolute confidence of a person who knows where she is going and expects the world to accommodate her. Walter's land was also accumulating something beyond cattle and fence line. A reputation. Men who ranched in the area knew that Ford's half-section was well-run and productively managed, that his cattle were healthy and his fences sound, and his word was his word. This had a value in that community that was practical as well as social, and it showed in the ways people dealt with them both, in the easy confidence of the business relationships, in the invitations that came to social occasions that mattered, in the way newcomers were directed to Walter when they needed reliable information about the land and the water and the way things worked. Lydia had a reputation of her own, built on 4 years of reliable delivery and fair dealing, and the school organizing, and the way she had of being in a community that was full presence without being performative. She was respected in Caldwell in the particular way that women who do the work earn respect in small towns, not flamboyantly but solidly, the kind that lasts. One afternoon in the autumn of 1881, when the leaves on the cottonwoods were turning, and Clara was 6 months old, and James was nearly 3, and chatting almost constantly about everything he observed. Lydia was sitting on the porch in the late sun nursing Clara when she saw Mrs. Parsons' buggy coming down the track. This was not unusual. The widow came out twice a month. But she was going faster than usual, and when she pulled up at the gate her face was different. "She passed this morning," Mrs. Parsons said from the buggy, without getting down, because she was 93 years old and getting in and out of buggies was not the enterprise it once had been. She was Mrs. Hanratty, who had been unwell since August. "Very peaceful. I thought you should know before you heard it on the route." Lydia felt the news settle into her. She had known Mrs. Hanratty was declining, had visited twice in September with the children, had sat with her in her small parlor behind the dry goods store while James played with the wooden toys she kept there as if specifically for grandchildren she had never had. "Thank you," Lydia said. "I am glad you came." "She thought very well of you," Mrs. Parsons said, with the slightly clipped precision of a woman who does not easily speak sentiment out loud. "She told me so several times." "I thought very well of her," Lydia said. "Walter was in from the north pasture by evening, and she told him, and they sat after dinner with the children asleep and talked about Mrs. Hanratty, about what she had been to the town and to them both specifically, and then they were quiet for a while in the way of people who are processing loss together, which is its own form of intimacy. She was the one who told me to leave the note on the saloon board," Lydia said, "when I was looking for you." "I saw the note," Walter said. "I know you saw the note," she said. "You came to find me." "I was going to find you anyway," he said. "I had been thinking about it since the auction. I was trying to decide how." "And the note settled it," she said. "The note settled it," he agreed. She looked at her hands in the lamplight, the gold band and the small garnet. "I wonder sometimes what would have happened if I had not put it up," she said, "if I had talked myself out of it." "I wonder about that too," he said. "I think I would have found another way eventually, but eventually is a long time." She reached over and took his hand. "I am glad I put up the note," she said. He turned her hand over in his and held it. "So am I," he said, endlessly. The years continued to build, one good season into the next, with the ordinary difficulties and ordinary joys that make up a real life rather than a story about one. The cattle herd grew to 20, then 30, then stabilized at a level that was profitable without outpacing what the land and their labor could sustain. Walter hired 2 more hands in 1882, and Eddie, now 21, and engaged to a girl from one of the northern farmsteads, was saving in earnest for his own quarter section, with Walter's active help in identifying and negotiating for the right land. James started at the Caldwell school in the fall of 1883, by which point he was 5 years old and had been reading simple words for over a year, because Lydia had been teaching him the way she did everything, steadily, and without sentimentality about timelines. He walked into the schoolhouse on his first day with his father's unhurried confidence and his mother's straight spine, and came home that afternoon with 8 new opinions about things and a friend named Henry, which Walter found extremely funny for reasons he had trouble articulating. The delivery route had, by 1883, become something more substantial than Lydia had originally imagined. She had formalized an arrangement with the general store and the hardware merchant that made her effectively the primary freight carrier for the farmsteads within a 15-mile radius of Caldwell. She had 2 wagons running full routes 4 days a week and employed 2 drivers, managing the whole operation from the Ford homestead with the organized precision that had always been her particular gift. She was earning well and reinvesting into the operation and the homestead in careful, considered proportions. She also, in the spring of 1883, found herself pregnant for the 3rd time. She told Walter in the morning over coffee, direct as always. He set down his cup and looked at her with a smile that was warm and not entirely surprised. "How do you feel?" he said. "Good," she said. "Absolutely good." She looked at him. "I think this might be the last one." "All right," he said simply, which was the right answer. "Does that seem reasonable to you?" she said, 3 children is a full household, he said. You would know better than I would. We would know together, she said. He nodded. 3 then, he said, unless the world has other ideas. The world can keep its ideas, she said, which made him laugh. The third baby arrived in October of 1883. Another boy, healthy and loud, and possessed of an impressive quantity of red hair that no one in either family could entirely account for, which became a subject of considerable gentle family humor for years. James, now 5, was largely pleased by this addition and immediately offered to teach the baby to count fence posts, which was deemed a future project. Clara, 2.5, examined the baby with the judicial seriousness she brought to most new developments, and then appeared to make a ruling in his favor, after which she treated him with the same decisive proprietary care she received from her older brother. They named him Robert William Ford, Robert for no particular name reason except that it suited him, and William for Walter's older brother who had died at Gettysburg, which Walter requested quietly when they were considering names, and which Lydia agreed to immediately. William, Walter said, holding Robert in the early morning light, the baby's red hair bright against his shoulder. He would have liked knowing there was someone carrying his name. Tell me about him, Lydia said. Walter talked about his brother for a long time that morning, stories she had heard pieces of but never all at once, and she listened with the full attention that she gave the things that mattered, and it was the kind of morning that was ordinary in its format and extraordinary in its content. 2 people in a warm kitchen with a new baby and old grief, and enough love to hold both things. Life on the Ford homestead in the middle years of the 1880s settled into a richness that was cumulative, layer upon layer of built things. The kitchen garden that expanded each spring, the herd that grew with careful breeding, the children who were each their own distinct persons with their own ways of being in the world, the relationship between Lydia and Walter that had deepened over the years from the careful, honest attention of its beginning into something rooted and complex and entirely alive. They disagreed sometimes, as people who are genuinely engaged with each other must. Lydia thought Walter was too cautious about expanding the cattle operation. He thought she pushed the delivery business harder than the margins warranted. These disagreements were conducted with the directness they had always used with each other, sometimes heated, always respectful, always resolved by the same process of sitting down with the actual numbers and the actual facts and working through them, until they found the place where both their thinking was right and could be combined. He surprised her regularly, and she surprised him, which she thought was the essential engine of a living marriage. He came home one spring afternoon in 1884 with a small piano that he had bought from a departing family in town, loaded onto a flat wagon and transported with extreme care, because she had mentioned once, months before, that she had played as a child and missed it. She had not expected him to remember and certainly not to do anything about it, and she stood in the yard looking at the piano on the wagon and felt the particular sweetness of being known in the specific way, seen in the detail. She sat down and played that evening, haltingly at first and then with the muscle memory coming back through her fingers, simple pieces she had learned as a girl, and the children sat on the floor and watched with the concentrated interest they gave to new things, and Walter sat in the chair by the window with his book open in his lap and did not read a page of it. "You should have told me sooner," he said when she finally stopped. "I had forgotten how much I missed it," she said. "Play it every day," he said. "There is no reason not to." She did play it most days after that in the evenings, and the sound of the piano became part of the particular texture of the house, woven into the fabric of what the Ford home sounded, and felt like in the way that all the specific chosen and unchosen things weave themselves into what a home becomes over years. By 1885, the bank note on the land was paid in full, both sections clear and owned without debt. Walter received the papers from the bank on a Tuesday morning and came in from town and put them on the kitchen table in front of Lydia with no ceremony, and she looked at them and looked at him, and they both felt the weight and significance of it, the thing he had come to Caldwell to build and had built. "Paid," she said. "Paid," he said. She stood up and put her arms around him, which was not her typical public mode of affection but was entirely warranted. And he held her, and they stood in the kitchen for a long, quiet moment with the papers on the table and the spring light coming through the south window and Robert playing in the yard and Clara's voice somewhere at the back of the house and James, who was 7 now, somewhere visible through the window moving with focused purpose toward the barn. "We built this," she said. "We did," he said. Together, she leaned back and looked at him. 7 years had changed them both in the ways that years of outdoor work and child-raising and hard, honest living change people, had put some lines in his face and gray at his temples and a few threads of silver in her dark hair. But the eyes were the same, his direct and dark and warm, her steady and green and as precise as they had ever been. "I'm very glad you left that coin on the table," she said. He smiled. "I am glad it worked," he said. "I was not entirely certain in the moment. It seemed like it might be presumptuous." "It was," she said. "It was exactly right." He kissed her in the kitchen in the spring morning light, with the deed to their land on the table and 3 children's voices threading through the walls of the house they had built. And it was exactly right, all of it, the way things are when they are made of the truth. The summer of 1885 brought 2 pieces of news that arrived within a week of each other. The first was from Nebraska, a letter from Lydia's brother Thomas saying that his wife had died of the same fever that had taken both their parents, leaving him with 3 young children and a farm that was managing but hard. The letter was not asking for anything directly, which was characteristic of Thomas, but Lydia read between the careful lines and heard what was actually being said. She put the letter down and sat with it for a day, which was long for her. Then she talked to Walter. "He needs to come here," she said. "He and the children, at least for a season, to get right." Walter looked at her steadily. "We have the room," he said. "The north room is not being used for anything essential." "It would be a great deal more people in the house," she said. 3 more children, and Thomas, who I love but who has my father's stubbornness in concentrated form." "I have managed your stubbornness for 7 years," Walter said. "I expect I can manage Thomas." She laughed despite herself. "That is generous of you." "Write and tell him to come," Walter said. "That is the right thing and you know it." She wrote the letter that evening and had it posted the next morning. The second news was that Eddie Marsh had bought his quarter section, to the east of the Ford land, and was going to be married in August. And the wedding was to take place at a small party at the Brannigan Ranch that everyone within 20 miles was invited to. This was the more celebratory news, and they marked it accordingly. Thomas arrived in late September with his 3 children, ages 4 to 9, and a quiet grief that he wore like a coat he could not take off. He was 32 and looked older, with the particular weathered thinness of a man who has been working without rest or comfort for too long. He stood in the yard when he arrived and looked at the house and the barn and the land stretching east and said, with a roughness in his voice, "You have done well, Lydia." "We have done well," she said, correcting the pronoun with intention. "Walter and I come inside." Thomas and Walter took each other's measure over the first week with the careful mutual assessment of 2 people who are equally stubborn about their own assessments and not going to rush it. But by the second week, they had found common ground in the practical work of the place, and by the third week, they were talking across the supper table with the easy directness of men who have decided to respect each other. Thomas's children, whose names were Annie, George, and little May, were absorbed into the Ford household with the particular fluid adaptability of children, and within a month the 6 children were a unit of sorts, navigating the yard and barn and kitchen garden together with the complex social ecology of a small mixed-age group. Thomas stayed through the winter and into the spring, and by spring he was talking about staying, if there was room and sense in it. There was land available east of Eddie's section that was reasonable, and Walter and Lydia walked it with him in April of 1886, and it was good land. They helped him make the offer and negotiate the note. And by May of 1886, Thomas Shelton was a Kansas landowner with 3 children and a renewed purposefulness that his sister recognized as the particular fire of a person who has something to work toward. He built a small house that summer with Walter and Eddie and James, who was 8 and deeply serious about being involved in construction, all pitching in on the frame. It was a simple house, not the Ford house but well built and solid, and the day Thomas moved into it was a good day that Lydia recorded in her journal, which she had been keeping since 1878, with the particular satisfaction of someone who has solved a difficult problem by the straightforward application of care. Life continued to open outward. Clara started school in 1886, taking to reading the way her mother had, with the focused consuming appetite of someone for whom books are not information delivery but worlds. James was showing his father's quality of quiet, purposeful competence, already capable with horses and increasingly with the cattle, spending his afternoons after school trailing Walter around the property with a working attention that was gratifying in a way Walter talked about sometimes in the evenings, not boastfully, but with a simple, moved satisfaction. Robert, the red-haired third, had turned out to be the most social of the 3, full of a warmth and easy friendliness that came from somewhere it was impossible to precisely identify. And the combination of these 3 distinct personalities under one roof created an ongoing daily texture that was loud and interesting and deeply right. In the fall of 1887, Lydia turned 35 and Walter threw her a party, which she had told him categorically she did not want, and which he organized anyway with the particular serene stubbornness that emerged in him on certain occasions, producing a Saturday afternoon gathering of most of the people who mattered to them. The Brannigans, Thomas and his children, Eddie and his wife Ruth, Mrs. Parsons in her best dress and formidable hat, Dr. Ames, several neighboring families, and a handful of Caldwell people who had been part of their years in the town. She stood in the yard of the house she had helped plan and watched the afternoon light on the people she cared about, James and George throwing a ball in the far corner, Clara and Annie deep in some serious conversation near the garden fence, Robert at the center of a cluster of younger children with the natural gregarious authority he seemed to have been born with, Thomas talking cattle with Brannigan with an animation she had not seen in his face the year before, and Walter moving between people with the ease of a man, entirely comfortable in the life he has made. He came to stand beside her at a certain point in the afternoon, the party in full swing around them, and handed her a cup of punch. "You organized this," she said. "I did," he said. "I told you not to," she said. "You did," he agreed. He was looking out at the yard with the quiet pleasure of a man watching something he built working well. "Are you angry?" She looked at him. At the gray that had spread further at his temples, at the lines around his eyes that came from years of squinting into the Kansas sun, at the easy fullness of his face in a moment of happiness. She thought of the coin on the table. She thought of a man walking through a door and out of sight before she could look up. She thought of the Sunday afternoons on a rented porch and the land at golden hour and the kitchen in the morning and the children and the years. "I am not angry," she said. "Good," he said. "I am very happy," she said. He looked at her then fully the way he had always looked at her, direct and warm and completely present. "So am I," he said. "Every day." She took his hand the way she had on the rise of the land 9 years before, and held it, and the party continued around them in the afternoon light. Mrs. Parsons passed away peacefully in the winter of 1888, in her own bed in her own house with her things around her, at a ripe age that the doctor estimated at somewhere past 80 but that she had never confirmed. She left her 30 acres to James Ford, with a letter that the lawyer read to Lydia and Walter that said, in the widow's characteristic spare style, "To James Henry Ford, who has the sense to listen and the patience to learn, which are the 2 most useful qualities a person can possess. See that the land is kept in good order. Your grandmother, Mrs. Alma Parsons. She had no formal claim to the title she used, but no one in that family had the slightest inclination to question it. James received this news at 10 years old with the gravity it warranted, and immediately went to ask his father what the appropriate first step in managing inherited land would be. Walter told him, and they rode out together that afternoon to look at the Parsons' acreage. And when they came back, James had thoughts about it that were organized and practical, and showed a comprehension of land management that was flattering and entirely unsurprising. The Ford homestead of 1889 was a different thing than the quarter section Walter had bought in 1878. The original half section plus Thomas's land to the east plus the Parsons acres to the north made the extended Ford family operation something substantial in the county, interconnected by blood and work, and the decade of accumulated trust between them. Walter's cattle herd had grown to a size that provided a reliable seasonal income. Lydia's delivery operation had become something she was beginning to consider transitioning, as the railroad's expansion was changing the freight economics into something slightly different, a supply arrangement with the larger ranch operations that used her established relationships rather than her wagon wheels. She sat down with Walter and went through the accounts and the projections in the way they always had together, with equal weight on both sides of the table, and came out of it with a plan for the next 5 years that was realistic and ambitious in the right proportions. "You are never still," he said, not as a criticism, as a statement of continuing wonder. "No," she agreed. "Does that bother you?" "Not for a moment," he said. "I knew it the first time I saw you. It was one of the things I liked first." She looked up from the account book. "What were the things you liked first?" He thought about it with the seriousness she still loved in him. "The way you sat in that room," he said. "Like you belonged there regardless of what anyone else thought. The way you counted those coins without looking up. The way you came out of that auction house with that horse and stopped in the yard and let yourself feel it for exactly as long as it needed and then looked up and started solving the next thing." He paused. "I thought that is someone worth knowing." She held his gaze. "You have known me for 11 years, she said. "Am I what you thought?" "You are more," he said simply. "You always have been." The spring of 1891 brought the news that Declan Brannigan had decided to reduce his operation and sell the north section of his spread, which bordered the Ford land. He came to Walter personally and offered it at a fair price before putting it on the open market, which was the kind of thing that happened when a man had spent 13 years being someone who could be counted on. Walter came home that evening and sat down at the kitchen table and told Lydia about it. The children were all in bed, James 13 and reading in his room, Clara 10 and already through most of the books the Caldwell school's small library contained, Robert 8 and asleep the instant his head met the pillow as he always was. "That would make us a significant operation," Lydia said. "It would," Walter said. "Can we carry the note?" "Barely," he said. "If the next 2 seasons are good." She looked at the account book open between them. She looked at him. "The next 2 seasons will be good," she said. "You do not know that," he said. "I know we will work hard and be careful," she said, "which is all we have ever known, and it has been enough." He held her gaze for a moment and then he smiled, slow and sure. "All right," he said. They bought the north section in May of 1891, and the Ford land was now something that would support James, and after him, his children, which was the kind of thing that could not have been imagined from a rented house on Laramie Street or from a morning at a livestock auction 13 years before, and which had become simply true through the accumulated weight of 1,000 right decisions made together. On a Sunday evening in the summer of 1891, the family was on the porch after supper, the long June light still gold over the grass, the cattle visible as dark shapes in the far pasture, the children ranged around in the particular comfortable sprawl of a family at rest. James was on the porch steps with a book. Clara was in the rocking chair Lydia had bought the year before, writing in her journal. Robert was lying on his back in the yard looking at the sky, which he did often and which the family had stopped questioning. Lydia sat in her chair with her mending in her hands that she was not doing, because the evening was too good to look at wool, and Walter was beside her with his coffee, and the meadowlarks were going in the grass, and the sky was enormous above the range. "James," Walter said, "come look at this sky." James looked up from his book. "I can see it from here," he said. "Come look at it properly," Walter said. James sighed with the magnificent theater of a 13-year-old and came and stood at the porch rail and looked at the sky, which was doing something extraordinary in the west, layering rose and gold and a deep orange that went all the way up to a clear piercing blue at the top. "All right," James said after a moment in a voice that was less theatrical. "That is something." "Yes," Walter said. Clara had put down her journal. Robert had sat up in the yard. They all looked at the sky together for a while, the Ford family on their land at the end of a long good day, and the meadowlarks sang in the grass, and the light slowly deepened and changed, and everything was, in this moment and in the long arc of all the moments before it, exactly and entirely right. Lydia set down her mending and reached over and covered Walter's hand with hers on the arm of the chair. He turned his palm up and held her hand, the way he had always done, and she felt the warmth of his hand and the smooth, worn gold of the ring on her finger, and the weight of 13 years of a real and full and truly good life. She looked at him and he looked back at her in the evening light, and there was nothing in either of their faces that needed explaining, because everything that needed to be said had been said, over years and meals and mornings and arguments and laughter and grief and work, and all the ordinary days that in their accumulation had become something extraordinary, which was their life, which was this. "Thank you," she said quietly, which was not quite the right words for what she meant, and also was exactly the right words for what she meant. He understood, as he always had, as he had from the first time she walked out of a livestock auction in a prairie town and stopped in the dusty yard and let herself feel something before she looked up and started solving the next thing. "Thank you," he said back. The meadowlark sang. The light went rose and then purple, and then the stars came out above the Kansas range, enormous and clear and present, and the Ford family sat under them on the porch of the house they had built until the children drifted inside one by one and the evening turned to night. And still the two of them sat, Lydia and Walter, hand in hand in the good dark, with everything they had built around them and everything they had become together, and it was more than enough. It was everything.